Hi, everyone. My name is Dan McLeod. I'm the managing editor of the Bangor Daily News. Welcome to our first of 4 climate conversations. We know that climate change is dangerously affecting our planet. Most of our audience lives within 50 miles of the Gulf of Maine, which is infamously warming faster than almost every other body of water on Earth. A recent poll we commissioned found that a vast majority of Mainers are concerned, even if their degree of concern falls along party lines. The topic of climate change can seem overwhelming, and our goal is to use these discussions to kick off a series of locally grounded and useful material to help people understand how the climate crisis is affecting their communities. These conversations will help shape our coverage of climate issues. This work is supported through a grant from the Facebook Journalism Project, which is helping the BDN reveal how local communities and Maine's industries are coping with and adapting to climate change. For each conversation, we are bringing together experts from the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute and local subject matter experts. We'll publish all reporting and commentary surrounding these climate conversations under a Creative Commons license, which means others can republish freely with citation. Discussions about how Mainers are grappling with climate change are just beginning, and we hope to legitimize these conversations and connect experts with people who could most be impacted. Our panelists are Joe Kelley, marine geologist and professor at the University of Maine School of Earth and Climate Scientists, Stephen Dixon, marine geologist at the Maine Geological Society, Susie Arnold, marine scientist at the Island Institute, Abby Roche, doctoral student in communication and sustainability science, University of Maine, Jonathan Beal, chair of the City of Belfast Climate Crisis Committee. Susan Young, who leads our editorial pages, will be leading the conversation. Before I hand it to her, I wanted to let you know a bit about our webinar. We will use the chat function to share information with you, but you won't be able to chat with us or each other. And if you have questions during this webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom to send them in. We will not have time to get to audience questions during this event, but we will use your questions in our reporting. And we'd like to answer your questions and publish a Q&A from this event, so please share them. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Susan. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for being here today. We're really excited. As Dan said, this is the first of 4 such events. So, we apologize for any bumps along the way ahead of time, but we're really excited to get going. And so Stephen Dixon is gonna kick us off along with Joe Kelley. They're gonna talk about the science and where we are currently with sea level rise and climate change as it affects the coast of Maine. So take it away, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks to the Bangor Daily News for hosting this event and starting the conversation here in Maine. And welcome to those of you that are joining online. I'd like to share with you in the next few minutes what the work we've been doing over the last half year that's sort of new and more comprehensive than anything that's been done before. Along with myself and Joe Kelley here on the panel, Peter Slavinsky of the Maine Geological Survey has worked with us closely to come up with new assessments of sea level rise and storm surge on the coast of Maine looking forward into the future. And we've been doing this work as a result of basically for the Maine Climate Council. And you can find this work online at the Maine Climate Council's website in a lot of detail with a lot of graphs and a lot of text, like 40 to 50 pages. So please turn to the Science and Technology section of the Climate Council's work or to a link on the Bangor Daily News. And in about a month or so, we expect that the final report will be out and available beyond now. So if we think back to the industrial era, say when Henry Ford was starting to build automobiles on an assembly line, a tide gauge went in Portland Harbor. And that gauge has been recording the rise and the fall of the tides, which is a good proxy for sea level. And we've seen since that gauge went in about 8 inches of sea level rise, or a rate of about 1 inch per decade. So as I think of it, I've been working at the Maine Geological Survey now for over 30 years. We've seen about probably 3 inches of sea level rise since I even started paying attention to sea level rise. Over the last 25 years or so, the world has seen an increase in the rate of sea level rise, and we've seen that acceleration here in the Gulf of Maine. The current rate is about 1 foot per century, and it's faster than anything we saw back in the 20th century. So most of that rise that we've been seeing even in the 20th century came at the tail end of the 20th century, around the 1990s in the last decade or so. So if you go and take a look online at the NOAA tide gauge data, and forecast graphs and so on, you can see how the tides are running, and you can compare it to the predicted tides. And the tides these days are running both monthly and annually above what is predicted. So we're above normal, or what's normal, used to be normal already, by about 1/2 foot. In the work we've done, we've used the National Climate Assessment scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions, rising global temperatures, glacial melting, and things like that to create customized maps for, and projections for Maine. This was based, all these numbers are based on an elevation starting in the year 2000. That's very typical in the scientific world. We start 2000 and we project out to the year 2100. So for an intermediate greenhouse gas emissions scenario, we're talking about maybe 1.1 to 1.8 feet by the year 2050. So in just 30 years from now, that's another 1 to 2 feet more of water and tidal action than what we've been used to. Looking ahead to the year 2100, the most probable sea level rise scenario is about 3 to 4.6 feet. So there's a 50-50 chance for the tides, the high tides, to be around 4 feet higher in the year 2100. There are other scenarios in our report that we've worked on that relate to higher emissions, sort of the business as usual scenarios with warmer planetary temperatures, and those are lower probability events. They range though in heights of 6 to 10 feet. So for long range planning purposes, there are those scenarios that are less likely but have high impact, say for a wastewater treatment plant or something like that. They'd be useful for that. So as sea level creeps up, it creates what we call nuisance flooding or blue sky flooding. And that's the type of way I think we're mostly going to start feeling and recognizing that sea level is rising. We're going to have times when we have to move cars out of parking lots, there's some roads we can't drive through and so on. And lately Portland has seen a 4-fold increase in nuisance flooding since relative to the 20th century. So coastal flood warnings will become more frequent. Some things may have to be planned around these full moon high tides, even on days without storms. Storms typically are northeaster, cause flooding and surf that can last through several high tide cycles. The storm surge or water pushed up onto the coast is in addition to sea level rise, and sea level rise will make storms more aggressive. In fact, it only takes a 1.5 foot rise in the ocean levels to turn the 10-year storm into one with the effect of a 100-year storm. In other words, the blizzard of 1978, our worst storm on record, will become 10 times more likely with a 1.5 foot sea level rise. So the combination of a 4 foot sea level rise and a 4 foot storm surge, like something we had last fall, means that the surf will roll into areas that are 8 to 10 feet above the current high tide. Even if greenhouse gases are reduced, sea level rise will continue for the next few centuries. So Maine should anticipate impacts from sea level rise far into the future. Our best scientific analysis says that we should be committed to dealing with 1.5 feet of sea level rise by the year 2050 and about 4 feet by the year 2100. And we should be preparing and anticipating for certain things 8 to 10 feet higher than present for an intermediate emissions pathway with storms, or from the worst case scenario of business as usual greenhouse gas emissions, 8 to 10 feet could be where the high tide line is by the year 2100. So with that information, I'll turn it over to Joe Kelley, who will give us a little bit more information on the impacts of sea level rise on the coast. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. It's interesting. I think the Bangor Daily News bringing this up. I remember when we started working here in the early, middle 1980s, if you talked about sea level rise, people just didn't have any clue. You were not going to persuade anybody of anything. It was just science fiction. So we've actually made great progress. I'm going to talk about the effect of the rise in sea level Steve has just spoken of on some of the major coastal environments. Now, there are two parts of our Maine coast: the hard coast, which is bedrock, think granite. I'm not going to go into that much because, you know, if your house is on a 30-foot granite cliff, you're going to watch the water come up, but it's not really going to be an issue to you because the rock is not going to erode. If you're on a low cliff, like President George H.W. Bush does or did down in Walker's Point, yeah, you may start seeing worse and worse storms because those low cliffs, though they're not going to erode, the water's going to get over them. But really, I want to focus on the soft coast, which are salt marshes, beaches, unconsolidated loose bluffs of glacial materials, tidal flats, and filled land. Salt marshes, about 20% of our coast, about 22,000 acres, are salt marshes. They're plant communities. About 60% of them, or a little more, are south of Penobscot Bay, owing to the topography of the local bedrock. There are two kinds of marshes: a low salt marsh, which is relatively low in elevation. It extends from about the average between between high tide and low tide. We call it mean tide level, to mean higher high water, the average of the highest tides of the day. And then there's a high marsh that replaces that as we go up a little bit, that extends from mean higher high water to the highest astronomical tide, which is the highest tide we'd see in a lunar 18.6 periodic year. The low marshes are really pushing it for some plants. These are terrestrial plants. They're at the outer edge of where they can be. They can't go seaward. Sea level comes up, they have to go landward or they will drown. There's no alternative. The high marsh is a very vertically restricted environment, more of a diversity of plants, but really not a great deal. It cannot go seaward. It cannot endure any more drowning. It has to go landward. And with rising sea level, it can grow landward, but that's when they run into us, property owners who prefer a lawn to a salt marsh, and they build a wall, and then the marsh can get squeezed out. Our marshes have been around for a while. They're many meters thick, more than 10 feet thick in most places. So everything has been great. Sea level has been rising really slowly for thousands of years, and our marshes and our beaches have been accumulating sediment, building out to sea in some instances. Well, that time is perhaps sadly over. We're really interested in whether the marshes are keeping up with the sea level rise, the rates that Steve has mentioned. And so for many years, many of us have gone out and made measurements of sea level rise in marshes. Very simply done. You take a meter square, cover it with brick dust, and come back in 20 years and see what accumulated. And recently a student of mine did that and found that between 1 millimeter and 4 millimeters per year of sea level of salt marsh buildup has been the norm. On the 1 millimeter side, that's going to be too bad. Those marshes are at risk. 4 millimeters is doing okay now, but when we see some of these other scenarios for the future, our marshes really don't have much of a chance with a rate of sea level rise in excess of 4 meters per year. So what's going to happen? Well, the low marshes are going to grow landward. The high marshes are going to try to grow landward. In some instances they will, but in other instances they're going to be blocked out by sea level, by seawalls. In many of our marshes, we're starting to see that now. In marshes that we've studied, we're seeing conversion of the high salt marsh to open water between 1 and 10% of the area from the 1950s up until the present time. So we're losing our land that way. I'll only add as an aside, Louisiana is losing 25 square miles of salt marsh per year to open water, but it's the same overall process. Our beaches are a great concern. They're 11% of our coast, sandy to the south, gravelly to the north. They get their sediment that has enabled them to build out from rivers, particularly the Saco, well, exclusively the Saco and Kennebec rivers, which have delivered sand and let the beaches of Saco Bay, think Old Orchard and Popham Beach, Reed Beach, grow considerably seaward over millennia. We also beaches get their sediment from bluffs that are eroding. But we'll see when homeowners are threatened, they want to stop that erosion, which endangers the bluffs. Sand on a beach can move along shore, parallel to the beach. It can move offshore, or in the case of rising sea level, the seaward side of the beach can erode and sand can be washed across the beach and the beach migrates. Now, if you're a homeowner and your house is destroyed in this process, it's erosion to you, but really I've done studies and we've seen that the beach volume can actually grow in this process. It doesn't get less. So our beaches have migrated into their present location, but now they're facing a problem. Sea level's rising faster and they're encountering walls along the coast. If we just simply dropped a 1.6 foot sea level rise on our present coast and didn't allow the beaches to move landward, we'd lose up to 43% of our dry beach space, the beach space you put your blanket on in the summertime. Good thing about beaches, and when Steve and I first came here, I was hired actually to come to the state to develop rules, and we have rules and laws that govern behavior around beaches, and they take into consideration sea level changes. So, you know, we don't allow building of new seawalls. If your house is destroyed several times by storms, you're not allowed to rebuild. We don't have public money going into some of our beaches. We have a whole system of beaches that precludes the spending of public money on them to protect them. Bluffs, I think, are the greatest threat, and I won't go into them very much because we don't know much about them. These are loose deposits. People don't understand them. Many of these are being developed all over the coast. People think they're on the rock-bound coast of Maine when they're on a 30-foot pile of mud with no strength at all. This is a big problem. They don't have flood insurance because they're not in a flood zone. If you in a computer mapping system, if you put the water level several feet higher, well, the bluffs aren't in any danger at all, it appears, but they are. Waves erode their bottom and cause catastrophic landsliding, and groundwater within the bluffs is always trying to get out. It freezes in the winter, but in late winter, early spring, we get big blocks falling down into the sea and landslides. I think this is the most dangerous part of our coast. It's 40% of our entire shoreline of bluffs, and I don't think people really know the threat they're facing and won't know it until, well, I used to work for the Maine Geological Survey. You get the call that says, I just lost 10% of my property. What's the state going to do? The last thing I'll mention is built land. That's filled wetlands, and it's all around the state, particularly in cities. We built it, and it's low, and we're going to have to just put some money on the ground and build it up higher because that land is going to go underwater increasingly down the road. So I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I have lots of questions to circle back with already, so looking forward to that. And Susie, among the many things that you're working on the Island Institute is working with local communities on the implications of climate change. So you're going to talk to us a little bit about what this means, you know, for ecosystems, for communities, for businesses, and a little bit about what we can do about it.
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to Steve and Joe and Peter Slavinsky for putting together a very impressive chapter by the Science and Technical Subcommittee. It is fascinating to nerds like me, but also accessible to everyone. So I highly recommend it if you're looking to dive into the details. You can find it at climatecouncil.maine.gov. There's also plenty of opportunity for the public to provide feedback on the strategies that pertain to sea level rise coming out of the Climate Council's 6 working groups. Almost all of the 6 working groups had strategies that related to sea level rise. It's a lot to dig through. I just posted on the Island Institute website a synopsis of all those strategies that pertain to sea level rise in just about 3.5 pages instead of about 300 pages. So if you don't have time to weed through everything on climatecouncil.maine.gov, but you do want to provide feedback on sea level rise, I can put the link to that summary in the chat. Also, I wanted to provide another resource for folks who might be teachers or parents and are looking for some kind of virtual learning tool that relates to sea level rise in Maine. You can go to YouTube and check out an O Chang Studios animated comic about sea level rise in Maine. You can just Google YouTube, sea level rise, Maine, O Chang, or Island Institute, and it will come right up. My 4-year-old loves it, and I know many adults laugh through it as well. So yeah, as for communities and what they're facing, this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all issue, both in terms of how communities are being impacted and also how communities are responding. So there are 120 coastal communities along the coast of Maine, and not 2 of those communities have exactly the same issue. So it may be that their critical infrastructure, like their wastewater treatment plant, is already being inundated at king tides. Maybe their entire downtown is being impacted, like Vinyl Haven and Damariscotta. Or maybe their freshwater aquifer, their only source of fresh drinking water, like Monhegan, is vulnerable to being impacted with a few feet of sea level rise. Or maybe they're sitting pretty, they think they're high up, but lo and behold, that access road that brings them to their business or their home is already being inundated during high tides and is very vulnerable to being inundated more frequently with sea level rise. So the threats are very individual to the community, and how each community is reacting to those threats is also very individual. It also relates largely to the capacity of the individual community to deal with this. We just heard about 10 minutes of pretty daunting information. And for a town manager of a small community that doesn't have an assistant or a sustainability officer to focus primarily on this, it can be difficult to know where to start. So I think the communities are responding anywhere from they're sticking their head in the sand, they don't know what to do, to having a sustainability officer. I think only 5 communities in Maine have a sustainability officer. So there's a big spectrum of the community's capacity in terms of their technical ability to respond to these threats. Many have volunteer sea level rise committees. I'm thinking about Vinyl Haven. John Beal from Belfast is going to talk more about their climate crisis committee. Some of these committees receive funding from the town, some don't. So the response largely, but not always, relates to how the municipality has the ability to respond. There are a lot of small communities that are really models for how they're responding despite lack of resources. And that largely has to do with their networks and how they're able to tap into the state's resources. Do they have an active regional planning organization that can provide some of that technical assistance? So I kind of put them into 3 categories of action. Are they paying attention, doing public engagement, community outreach, building their networks to understand what resources exist? That's kind of the first stage after doing nothing. Are they assessing their vulnerabilities? Have they received some funding from the state to begin to plan, to hire an engineering firm to take a look at what their vulnerabilities are? You know, what critical infrastructure is going to be flooded and when? And then finally, are they really managing their risk, and are they actually funding implementation projects? There's some examples of that, but I would say the large majority of communities fall in the first 2 categories. So there are a lot of resources in the state. There's, the Maine Geological Survey, I think, is the first place folks would go to look at a map viewer to get an understanding of where their vulnerabilities lie, just by plugging in different levels of inundation and seeing where the water is. As is mentioned, that's kind of a bathtub model, so it doesn't give you what the flooding will be with a storm surge or some kind of storm on top of that, but it's a good first place to start. There's planning grants available through the state that a lot of communities are accessing. Those are coastal community grants through the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. There are shore and harbor grants. If you're looking at kind of your working waterfront infrastructure, those are available through DMR. The Island Institute puts out, we've given out about $110,000 for just planning around sea level rise, kind of seed money, and that money has already leveraged nearly $1 million in other funding coming to coastal communities. So we've helped about 25 coastal communities thus far, and we have $75,000 worth of usually in about $10,000 chunks to give out to help communities either provide match for some of these state resources, or to provide just like initial engineering studies that are required for other federal grants. So engineering firms are coming in and doing their part. I think a big bottleneck for action in the state has to do with funding, and a lot of the strategies and technical assistance. And a lot of the strategies coming out of the Climate Council have to do with improved technical assistance for communities, and then ways, or innovative ways for communities to fund these implementation projects. So maybe they do have a good understanding. Maybe they've had a vulnerability assessment, and they know where their risks are, but it often takes a long time to fund that implementation of the project. I think Damascotta is I used to use it as a kind of a sad story about illustrating the bottleneck when a community can't find funding to do what they know that they need to do. And now I'll use it as a success story because they recently received funding from the Economic Development Association, $3 million to help implement some of the work that they know they need to do around their downtown to prevent future flooding. So I'll leave it at that. I could talk more about funding and bottlenecks, but I'll pass it on to John Beal to talk from the community perspective about Belfast.
Thank you, Susie. Again, thanks to BDN for convening us on this important subject. I'm on the Belfast Climate Crisis Committee. We started out as a climate change committee, but we decided that one of the things we wanted to do was to convey urgency. So we changed the name to Climate Crisis. We've had good support from the City Council. We've had a lot of different projects, which I'll describe in a moment. But one of the first things that we decided we needed to do was to try and identify, or have the town identify, its risk horizon. That's a term we use to describe how far out in time and how much sea level rise to anticipate in making plans. If a city decides only to think out till 2030, it makes a very big difference than if they decide to plan out to 2050 or 2100. Likewise, if they want to take the assumption that everyone in the world will meet the Paris Agreement and that sea level rise will be limited to the lower scenarios, that's a lot different planning than if you assume business as usual, which is essentially what we're doing now, which, as was indicated, could result in Penn Bay rising up to 10 feet by 2100. So the degree to which you decide your risk horizon is really a political decision of the city. And in order to be supportable, it's got to have public support. We're going to plan out based on 8.6 RCP and 10 feet of rise without getting a lot of pushback if people in the town are not on board. So most of our last 2 years has been educational. We've had, the first thing we did was we developed 3 reports on sea level rise in Belfast, describing the science, as Steve and Joe have just described, and the predictions for Belfast, and some recommendations. We then had various public meetings, excuse me. We've had public meetings at which we described those reports, and at which we also talked about other climate-related issues, such as installing solar panels, climate emergency, efficiency Maine, et cetera. COVID has made us pause for the last few months, but we'll be resuming our public meetings in September with a discussion of public health issues related to climate change done through Zoom. In addition, I've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers on the high watermark project, where they're documenting throughout the coast of Maine the height of the 1978 blizzard, and documenting with different scenarios how high that water would come with sea level rise of different heights. We're going to have several spots on the Belfast waterfront which will describe that. Likewise, we've been working with Gulf of Maine Research Institute on a couple of different projects. Abby Roach will be talking about the biggest one. Another one is a new project just begun called a Belfast Climate Dialogue, which will result in up to 10% of the people of Belfast having individual conversations and dialogues with one another concerning climate change and their approaches to it. In addition, we are participating with the Maine Coastal Observation Alliance in doing water testing in our harbor. That project goes all the way from Freeport up to Belfast, measuring acidification and chemistry in the bay. We've also worked with the city in filling out the flood resiliency checklist, which is a form for going through the different vulnerabilities a town may have, as recommended by the planning associations. That's a brief look at what Belfast has been doing to try and get its head around what's coming in the next few decades. And I'll hand it off to Abby.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. My name is Abby Roach. I am a communications scholar and doctoral student in the Communication and Journalism Department at the University of Maine. And the work that I do is focused on really asking questions about how we communicate about our environment and our climate. And I've been asked to speak today about how we communicate the science and actions that others on this panel have so graciously outlined. So in other words, unpacking some of this information with an eye towards action, specifically communicative action, or how can we communicate about the information we have about our changing climate and the impacts that we'll have on our communities in a way that we can make change. Now, immediately when I start to think about everything that's been talked about today, I start to think about, okay, how do we engage the public? How do we engage scientists? What types of messages work? What do we want the public to know and do? And what about the policymakers and what information do they need? Now, in communication studies and really sustainability science writ large, we have information about the types of messages that work. And we know the ways to communicate to people from getting a message to one person to another. But what we're still figuring out are the ways in which we go beyond passing on the information and taking action. So we've heard from others today talk about the data and the actionable needs. So I'd say at this point, all of us together, all of you who are watching, we're very primed to understand that we must do something. And we understand what some of the hurdles are, but kind of where do we go from here? I'd like to focus really quickly on some of the things that Susie talked about and also what John just touched on. And Susie mentioned the need to build networks, assess vulnerabilities, and then also trying to plan and manage risks within communities. And kind of in the same vein, I would really ask that we all start to consider for a moment the ways in which we can start to do this. And in the 3 minutes that I have today, I guess where I'd really like to focus my energy and time is starting to consider how we can do that through collaborative action. So to me, one of the themes that I heard today is individuals starting to consider, okay, so if we need to take action, how do we do it? And what I'm hearing is that there's lots of individuals who have really, I guess, specific expertise that goes from scientists or experts who know the climate data to communities who know what they want and what they need out of their communities, and they can start to identify where some of those risk points are. And so in this way, the best place to start is within the communities, not only asking and engaging with communities on what their needs are, but in the process, building relationships with research organizations. So in other words, building our collective capacities to respond together to these ever-changing needs in the face of our changing climate. So one way to frame this type of, I guess really what I'm talking about and what a lot of us have talked about here today is talking about it through the lens of citizen science or community science. Most basically, community science is the involvement of the public in the scientific process. So in this way, it's research institutions and everyday citizens forming partnerships to collect data and report on that data and then take action together. Now, what I really want to have us focus on for just a moment is and highlight is the togetherness aspect or the partnership component of citizen science or community science. And all across Maine, research institutions and municipalities have collaborated to start to ask questions about where are the risks? What do we need to do? Where do we need to collect data? And then how do we put that data into action? So what I'm talking about here is some of what Susie touched on, most definitely some of the work that John has taken with the Belfast Climate Crisis Committee. And then others, as I was looking at the participant list here today, we have other individuals that I recognize names, for example, Parker Gassett, who works for Maine Sea Grant, doing some of this work as well. But I'd really like to focus on a wonderful example of this type of collaborative work that's happening between the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, GMRI, and 4 municipalities in Maine. It's being led by GMRI, specifically Gail Bowness and Sarah Kern, and communities of Vinyl Haven, Belfast, Portland, and South Portland. And they're in the process of building a technology-supported citizen science initiative that's really inviting and guiding constituencies within these communities to identify community priorities and contribute observational data needed for this evidence-based community decision-making and also action. So in this way, the project, and the reason that I'm bringing it up is that it's built on intra-community interactions. It's built on this idea of building capacities and building relationships between, in this case, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and these municipalities. And in this way, the municipalities are discussing personal and collective understandings of risks, their likelihoods, and then also community values in order to identify these specific and actionable data points and what to collect and for what purpose. So in other words, we have research institutions partnering with communities in order to ask questions, collect data, and then use this data to make change. So I guess where I'll be leaving you all with today is maybe less of a solid answer, but more of an area of focus, which to me is this idea of togetherness or starting to think about collaborative action or building capacity. And where I come into the picture and some of the interests that I have and some of the ways that I'd be interested in those of you in the audience is starting to consider kind of how we can start to forge some of these collaborations. Susie identified some really great avenues, but starting to consider how communities and research institutions can work together to start to ask these questions, but then take the data to the next level. So in other words, starting to think about what do we need to nourish, amplify, and extend relationships that are needed in our changing world. And I'll end it off there and really looking forward to having conversations with everybody else.
Thank you very much, Abby. And I want to build off something you said about building the communities, building the collaborations. We've talked a lot, or at least touched on kind of the built environment, the risks to homeowners with coastal flooding, with erosion, or the bluffs washing away. I wonder, and maybe Susie, you can start us off, what are the ecosystem implications? To me, that seems like a way that this becomes an issue. Obviously, we're talking about coastal resiliency, but this is an issue for the entire state of Maine as it affects some of our trademark industries like fisheries and other industries. So what are the ecosystem implications of the changes that Joe and Stephen have chronicled? And how can we use that perhaps as a way to spread this conversation to the entire state of Maine, not just coastal communities?
Sure, I'll kick us off and then I'll hand it back over to Steve and Joe because I think they actually study the natural ecosystem component much more than I do. But when I think of ecosystem implications, I think of salt marshes and marsh migration. Will they be able to move landward or is there coastal development in the way? Will they get flooded out as sea levels rise? I also think about clam flats, and I don't know if anyone is looking into this at all, but at what point will clam flats be inundated so that clammers are no longer able to access that resource? That's something that I've always wondered about myself. So I think that the Climate Council in the Natural and Working Lands group has really addressed some of the impacts that are expected for coastal ecosystems. But Steve and Joe, I'll give you guys a chance to answer that as well.
Oh, thanks, Susie. I'll mention one thing about the beach environments, which we put out in the report, and it's kind of new to us even, was how vulnerable the dune areas are. So as sea level comes up, of course, is encroaching on both sides of the dune, sometimes from the salt marsh side and the back barrier environment, and sometimes from the ocean side with the surf. And if we take a static sort of bathtub model approach, a 1.6 foot sea level rise really reduces the area that's already developed in the coastal sand dune system by about 85%. And 3.9 feet is going to basically flood or create tidal land on 90% of the developed coastal sand dunes in Maine. So that's a pretty large impact in a small area, but a large part of our economy, depends on that, the beach environment. So they're very vulnerable, and we have not been able to do up to this point an assessment of how erosion will also change as a result of the higher water levels. So it's likely there'll be more erosion because the surf and the tides will come higher and higher. But that's an example of an area I think that's an ecosystem both in a human sense, but also for piping plovers and least terns and its habitat for at least some of the endangered species in Maine.
I would emphasize, just personally, I think salt marshes are the ecosystem that will most affect what's going on. But I'll couch that and say, there was a time when there weren't extensive salt marshes on the Maine coast. I remember working down in Wells, Maine, which has large salt marshes today, and seeing really extensive shell middens, Indian garbage piles, but shells, clams, and even oysters possibly. Well, there weren't marshes there then. There was large productive clam flats, and it may well be that we're going to revert to large tidal flats at the expense of salt marshes. And it's going to result in a shift in how we use these environments and how a lot of other organisms use these environments. And I think the past is our guide to the future. People got by, we'll certainly get by, but it's going to be a different situation.
Now, I'd like to add one more number for you. I know I'm throwing out lots of numbers today, but for every foot of sea level rise, 7,400 acres goes underwater along the coast of Maine. So that's a pretty significant footprint, if you will, for every foot of sea level rise. So there's quite a bit of land to become tidal in the future.
Steve, that reminded me of a presentation you gave at our kickoff meeting for the Science and Technical Subcommittee about the bomb cyclone that happened last October. And I think you said that had that storm occurred at high tide, there would have been something like 45 square miles that were flooded as a result.
Right. And that just brings up the point that, you know, even with climate change, there may be more intense storms. But that bomb cyclone, I think it was in October, you know, knocked out power for 250,000 people in Maine. And that's where people felt it or noticed it. And yes, the tide wasn't high. And so we kind of missed the bullet there. And we have the possibility of these storms coming basically out of nowhere. You know, the tropical storms come out of the, you know, the southern latitudes. The National Hurricane Center gives us several days of warning. And that one bomb cyclone in the fall appeared off the North Carolina coast, and we had less than 48 hours of notice before it hit us. And one of the things I've been concerned about and watching ever since Superstorm Sandy is there appear to be storms out there in the Atlantic that are missing us, but not by much, that are hurricane strength in the wintertime. And we really haven't been smacked head on by one of those yet. But I think, you know, the day may come where we have a superstorm come out of nowhere with very little advance notice with the intensity that we haven't seen. I mean, our superstorm that Pete Slavinsky and I have worked on is really, you take a king tide and you add, you take the storm we had in the blizzard of '78 and you still add 2.5 more feet of water on top of that. So it's a lot of water. And then there's the wave action, of course, which can be 20 feet in the coastal area.
As you say, Steve, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of grim data that should get our attention. I want to focus on, I think, Susie, you put it really well, data and reports that fascinate the nerds, but are also accessible to everyone. So maybe Abby, you know, are there messages that we know work? What are some strategies that are helpful? And Jonathan, your work with the Climate Crisis Committee could also be informative, you know, for communities, for community members who want to start similar efforts in their towns. You know, what is effective to bring more people along to address opposition? You know, in Belfast, you're talking about limiting development in certain areas. I'm guessing that's somewhat controversial for some folks. So what kind of strategies are useful to get people more engaged, number one, to understand the problem, but also to want to take action, whether it's encouraging their local leaders to get more engaged or to take personal action to do something? So, you know, what are messaging and strategies that we know work?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think most basically one of the biggest areas that I've seen, both in the literature and then also through my own experience, is really working through relationships and working through having personal conversations with individuals and finding ways to, I guess, tease out some of the concerns that individuals have. There was a really great question in the Q&A from Stephen Rutter asking, what do we do when we have politically polarized communities? How do we make this type of collaboration work? And I think in those types of situations, and I think it gets back to your question, Susan, is we start to consider how can we find some common ground? What are the areas that we all can maybe think about together, that we're all concerned about together? Maybe some of those will differ in some ways, but starting to have conversations there. And I mean, I think too, that somebody who could maybe answer this question really well too is John, and some of the work that he's done with the Belfast Climate Crisis Committee. Right there, you have an exemplary example of individuals coming together under a common purpose. I'm sure they all have different views in some ways, but they really came together under the idea that they were interested in talking together and having conversations and building relationships. So maybe a bit amorphous answer there, but maybe not a one size fits all for everyone, but I guess starting with personal and moving out from there.
I think in Belfast, more of our concerns are about the built structure than about marshes and beaches, which we don't have. For instance, several of the areas that we are studying in our GMRI citizen science program are going to be flooded with a certain amount of rise. One whole road will be gone. We have a boathouse, a wonderful facility that the town uses for all sorts of things. And because of the 10-mile fetch and the prevailing winds, it's understood that with a certain amount of sea level rise, that's just not going to be savable. We will lose that. One of the things we did in our study was to show how much taxable private property was going to be inundated and how much tax base for Belfast might be lost. Those things help to concentrate people's focus. Another thing is, for instance, some companies are already adapting to sea level rise. A big boatyard on our waterfront is built with drains so that when it floods, as it does, the water will drain right out. And its electrical facilities are 5 feet above the ground. There are no plugs at the bottom. So we're already adapting, and we're already developing a consensus in town that, yes, this is a problem and we need to address it.
One thing we haven't talked about is financial resources. And I'm wondering, in your experiences, which is more important, or maybe they're equally important, building that community understanding and support for action, or is it having funding available so that communities, the state, whatever entity it is, can actually begin to take actions that are necessary to adapt and protect communities? It's a question for everybody.
Well, I'll offer you a thought. Beaches, it's very popular in the United States today to replenish a beach, put new sand on it. Homeowners love it, but it costs an enormous amount of money. And the average life of a beach replenishment project in the US East Coast is 5 years or less than 5 years. So it's an eternal cost and it's large. I'm sure if you ask somebody in Aroostook County, are they willing to pay taxes to put sand on some fairly private beaches? You can go to the beach, but you can't park near it. They would oppose that. And so I think deciding how we deal with some of these beach issues is going to be a very costly effort. And I don't expect we'll get federal money helping us out.
Yeah, Susan, I think that's a great question, and I think they're both important. I mean, you need to have the awareness in order to act, but you need to have the money to implement the solution. And the implementation often is millions of dollars that small communities don't have. And I think that FEMA has adapted so that they have pre-disaster funding available, which is great. But we can't rely on the federal government, I don't think, to save us here. Unfortunately, one of the strategies coming out of the Maine Climate Council that has been recommended is the creation of a state infrastructure climate adaptation fund in order to position communities to actually be able to fund these excessive local cost shares that they can't afford currently. I come back to Damascotta. Their bottleneck was funding. I mean, they raised through taxes and local donations, they raised about $1 million. Still wasn't close to being enough to do what they needed to do. So I think that, getting back to your question, I think they're both important, and I think that they've both been addressed very thoroughly through the strategies coming out of the Climate Council.
Another potential avenue, or another part of this puzzle that you guys all identified in the technical subcommittee, is that oftentimes our laws don't mesh up necessarily with the reality of what we're facing. You highlight that we have a lot of laws around, again, the built environment, but not so much for ecosystem protection for climate change. So I wonder if we can talk just really quickly about the role for municipal ordinances, state laws, federal laws to make sure they align with the scope of the problem and the adaptations and changes that are going to be needed in the future.
Just a thought. I've observed ordinances passed, in Augusta, laws, but directing code enforcement officers, local people to enforce these is a very ineffective way to do this. These people are under tremendous local peer pressure and stress, and often have great difficulty fulfilling the obligations that the state has imposed on them. I'm thinking of ordinances that preclude engineering an eroding bluff in many instances.
Okay, I'm gonna pivot to something really different. Obviously, this is, as John's committee identifies, a crisis. We've talked about a lot of the concerning negative implications, and I don't want to downplay those at all. But are there any opportunities for Maine as our coastal environment changes? Are there any positives and plus sides that we shouldn't overlook?
Need to be negative, but I mean, rising sea level is taking our land away from us. People in England and Ireland get pretty personal about these things. Sand on some beaches will benefit some people. It'll move to a new place, and lucky them. But there's still going to be a losing group. So I'm challenged to think of very much positive about this.
I'll add in, I think they're in a positive way. I mean, there is a lot of high ground in Maine and along the coast. I mean, there is plenty of high ground. It's just that there's a lot of development already existing on the low ground, and there may need to be some managed retreat or some kind of direction. But I think the coastal areas are still going to be popular. The Gulf of Maine is warming, but it's still relatively cool in these hot summer days. And I think even with the pandemic, people are starting to look about, telecommuting and moving to Maine. So I think we may actually see some immigration and increase in population and talent in the state as a result of some of the environmental forces elsewhere. I mean, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all those low-lying southeast coasts, Louisiana, Mississippi, Maine's a good place to be.
I think to the point of trying to find hope or trying to find, have other ways of thinking about this, that's something I personally struggle with, and it's something that I know a lot of people that I talk to think about a lot. One resource that I have, I mean, it doesn't necessarily give answers, but I've found hope in it, and I've also found, I guess, realness, is the book Rising by Elizabeth Rush. Really fantastic book all about sea level rise, and it takes a really fantastic approach, combining a poetic kind of approach while also really putting in some hard data in there, and she interviews and gets stories all across the country. So maybe not an answer, but a way to look for hope, but also kind of seeing harsh realities.
I appreciate the message that you're all spreading about collaboration and building community networks and working across disciplines and different interests. But in the questions from our audience, we're getting some skepticism that that's a lot harder than it sounds. And I think especially Jonathan, since your group has done it, what kind of opposition did you face in Belfast, and was it hard to bring people along? Was there even opposition to changing the name of the group from the Climate Committee to the Climate Crisis Committee? And how did you overcome, that negativity?
Well, we worked with the city council on the change name, and frankly, one of our members did a really, I think, moving presentation about the crisis, the nature of the crisis. And I think this is around the time Greta Thunberg was speaking her piece. So it was an opportune moment. We haven't had much pushback from anyone in town. We have had a lot of the same people attending many of our meetings. One of the things we need to do is to reach out to more elements in the community. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited by this ABCD program that GMRI is going to implement with our library, where we have the dialogues of at least 10% of the people of Belfast. Just to answer one of your questions about the positive parts, I was really pleased looking at Susie's précis of the Climate Council decisions that nature-based solutions were being pressed as an idea to be adopted. Those, as far as I understand it, things like living shorelines are still in development phase and really have not been accepted by the bureaucracy as appropriate. I'd love to see more work on that so that our solutions can be nature-based and not just adding riprap. I think there's an opportunity for growth there. I think to follow on, I think Steve's comment, I imagine we're going to have thousands and thousands of people moving down east if we ever get a good broadband there. Anybody who spent the last 4 months in a high-rise in New York City probably is looking for alternative digs. So I think there could be a lot of interesting new developments based on this.
Great, thank you. So I'm curious, we said we were going to have some interaction between all of you and we kind of skipped over that. Do you have questions for one another? Okay, I thought you guys would have something that you want to share.
Well, I'll just add a comment. I mean, I think John's in a great place. People in Belfast are supportive. I don't want to sound negative, but I've had to have sheriff's escorts go to towns with me because people did not like, hearing about sea level rise and hearing about restrictions on development. So I've got a long ways to go on collaborative work.
So Joe, from your experience, how do you work with those folks? I mean, obviously not necessarily in the moment when they're threatening, but how do we bring people along to understand what's at risk and then what needs to be done?
Steve and I had a great project still ongoing, which was to go to homeowners and organize them into groups, team them, train them to measure the topography of their beaches monthly and to post that information on a website, which they've been doing. And we had disputes about facts. Was the beach eroding? Was it not? Well, now you've measured it. And, when you've measured it, it's your information. And I think that could be a model for other citizen science projects. I think citizen science is the only hope of really bringing people into this.
Yeah, I agree. I'll end on a cheery example. I was invited to the community of St. George, all the way down the peninsula, and to give an evening lecture on sea level rise. And I thought, there'd be a few retired folks and me and the town manager. And the room was packed, and it was packed with, middle-aged people. It was packed. There was a few school kids. I won't say it was packed with school kids, but there were children there, and there were retired folks as well. And I think that what we have going for us in educating folks around sea level rise is you can see it. You can usually speak, if you live on the coast, and I know in my community, I can think of 3 areas that are flooding, and the flooding is getting worse, and I have noticed it in my lifetime. So usually people have a local example. I also work on ocean acidification, which you can't see. And so we have that going for us. It's something that people can understand and visually see themselves. And I think that can be motivating, especially when it impacts their own property. That can be motivating to get people to show up.
Well, thank you very much, Susie. And we're at precisely 5 o'clock. So perfect timing and good to wrap up on a somewhat positive note. I mean, obviously, this is a problem that warrants all of our attention and action, but also highlighting there are positives, there's opportunities for community engagement and people to really take ownership, of their future, of their community and of our state. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. Our time went really quickly, but we certainly appreciate all of our panelists. We appreciate everyone who joined us for this webinar. And thanks to Melanie for all the behind the scenes work and to Dan for kicking this off. hope to see virtually a lot more of you at our future events. So keep an eye out for emails about those. And again, just thank you everyone for joining us.